What happens when a man who demanded total control loses everything in the most public way possible? Stay till the end because this shocking twist changes everything. And if you love real, unfiltered drama like this, hit subscribe right now because you don't want to miss what's coming next. For over a decade on reality television, one man built his entire world on a single expectation: absolute obedience. Not respect earned through love, not loyalty built through trust, but control. Total, unquestioned control. And for years, it seems like that system would never break. The structure held firm, the roles were clearly defined, the father at the center, the wives orbiting around him, and the children expected to follow the path laid out without resistance, without hesitation, without question. But beneath that surface, something was slowly shifting, something quiet but powerful, something that could not be controlled no matter how hard he tried. And that shift would eventually lead to one of the most shocking and symbolic moments ever seen, because the very foundation he spent years enforcing was beginning to crack. Not all at once, not dramatically at first, but piece by piece, moment by moment. Every time independence showed up, it was labeled as defiance. Every time a boundary was set, it was treated as betrayal. And instead of building stronger connections, those reactions created distance. Instead of strengthening loyalty, they planted doubt. And over time, that doubt grew into something undeniable. The sons, who were once expected to fall in line, began to see things differently. They began to question, not out of rebellion, but out of awareness. They began to recognize that respect cannot be forced, and that love cannot exist in an environment where fear takes the lead. And slowly but surely, the dynamic began to change. The control that once defined everything started to lose its grip, and in its place, something stronger began to form. Clarity. The kind of clarity that changes everything. The kind that makes you step back and reevaluate what truly matters and what no longer fits. And then came the moments that would shift everything completely. A moment that was not loud or chaotic, but deeply symbolic. A moment that carried more weight than any argument ever could. Because instead of following the expected path, the sons chose something different. They chose to stand beside their mother, not behind, not distant, but fully present. And that choice spoke volumes. It told a story of growth, of strength, of transformation. It showed that the very people who were once expected to obey had now stepped into roles of support, of protection, of leadership. And this was not about revenge. It was not about proving a point. It was about showing up in a way that had been missing for so long. And as this moment approached, the significance of it became impossible to ignore, because walking someone down the aisle is not just a tradition, it is a statement. It is a symbol of trust, of care, of presence. And this time, the roles had shifted in a way no one could have predicted. The sons were no longer standing in the shadow of expectation. They were standing in the light of their own choices. And that shift carried a powerful message, one that could not be ignored or rewritten or dismissed, because it was happening in real time, in front of everyone. And while some may have seen it as a break from tradition, others recognized it for what it truly was: a reflection of change, a sign that something new was shaping shape, something healthier, something more balanced, something rooted in genuine connection rather than control. And as the day unfolded, the atmosphere reflected that change. There was no tension, no uncertainty, no need to walk on eggshells. There was only presence, only support, only a sense of calm that had been missing for far too long. And in that calm, there was strength, the kind that does not need to be announced or demanded, the kind that simply exists because it is real. And for the first time in a long time, the focus was exactly where it needed to be, not on authority, not on power, but on the moment itself, on the meaning behind it, on the people who chose to show up in the ways that truly mattered. And that is what made it so powerful, because it was not just about one event. It was about everything that led up to it, every decision, every conversation, every realization that slowly but surely brought everyone to this point. And as those steps were taken, as that walk down the aisle began, it became clear that this was more than a ceremony. It was a turning point, a visible, undeniable shift from one chapter to another, a chapter no longer defined by expectation, but by choice, no longer shaped by pressure, but by intention. And that is where the real impact lies, because moments like this do not just happen, they are built over time, through actions, through experiences. It's through the willingness to grow and change, even when it is difficult. And while some may struggle to accept that change, others embrace it because they understand that growth often requires letting go of what once felt certain and stepping into something new, something unfamiliar, but ultimately better. And that is exactly what we are seeing here, a transition from one way of living to another, from a structure that relied on control to one that values connection. And the difference between those two is impossible to ignore, because one demands while the other supports. One restricts while the other allows space to grow. And when that contrast becomes clear, it changes everything. It reshapes perspectives, it challenges long-held beliefs, and it opens the door to something more meaningful. And as this story continues to unfold, the question is no longer about what happened, but about what it represents. Because at its core, this is not just about a family. It is about a universal truth that resonates far beyond one situation. It is about the idea that respect must be earned, that presence matters more than position, and that true strength is not found in control, but in the ability to show up consistently with care, with understanding, and with authenticity. And that is what makes this moment so unforgettable, because it captures all of that in a single powerful image, one that tells a story of change, of resilience, of a new beginning that no one can take away or redefine. And as everything continues to move forward, one thing remains certain. The past may have shaped the journey, but it does not define the destination. And what comes next will be built not on expectation, but on choice. And that difference changes everything. As the moment settled and the weight of everything that had unfolded began to fully register, what followed was not chaos or confrontation, but something far more powerful. A quiet, undeniable shift that could be felt in every interaction, every glance, every unspoken understanding between the people present. Because this was not just the closing of one chapter, it was the clear beginning of another. And unlike the past, this new chapter was not built on expectations or rigid roles, but on a foundation of mutual respect and genuine presence. And that difference could be seen in the smallest details, the relaxed conversations, the unguarded laughter, the absence of tension that had once defined so many moments in the past. It was as if a heavy weight had finally been lifted, creating space for something lighter, something healthier, something real. And in that space, people began to show up differently, not out of obligation, but out of choice. And that choice carried a meaning that went far beyond the surface, because when someone chooses to be present, when they choose to support, when they choose to stand beside rather than above, it changes the entire dynamic of a relationship. It removes the fear of not measuring up. It replaces pressure with encouragement, and it allows authenticity to take the lead. And that authenticity was evident in every part of the celebration. It was in the way conversations flowed naturally without hesitation. It was in the way smiles reached beyond the surface and reflected something deeper, something genuine, something that had been missing for a long time. And as the evening continued, the significance of what had taken place became even clearer, because this was not just about a single event. It was about a series of decisions that had led to this exact moment. Decisions to set boundaries, decisions to prioritize well-being, decisions to step away from patterns that no longer served a positive purpose. And while those decisions may not have been easy, They were necessary because growth rarely happens in comfort. It happens when people are willing to face difficult truths and choose a different path. And that is exactly what had been done here. A path had been chosen that valued peace over conflict, clarity over confusion, and connection over control. And as that path unfolded, it revealed something important, something that could not be ignored no matter how much someone might try to hold on to the past, because the reality was clear. The dynamics had changed, the roles had evolved, and the narrative that once seemed fixed was no longer in place. And while that realization can be difficult for some, it is also an opportunity to reflect, to understand, and to grow. But that opportunity requires a willingness to let go of old perceptions and embrace a new perspective, one that acknowledges that relationships are not defined by titles or expectations, but by actions and consistency. And when those elements are missing, no amount of authority can replace them, because at the end of the day, people respond to how they are treated, not to what they are told. And that truth was evident in the way everything unfolded, because the focus was no longer on maintaining an image or fulfilling a role. It was on being present in a meaningful way. And that presence created a sense of stability, a sense of trust, a sense of comfort that allowed everyone to fully engage in the moment without hesitation, without doubt, and without the need to look over their shoulder. And that kind of environment does not happen by accident. It is built over time, through intentional choices, through consistent actions, through the willingness to prioritize what truly matters. And as those elements come together, they create something that cannot be forced or replicated, something that exists naturally because it is rooted in authenticity. And that authenticity is what sets this moment apart. Be a part of the story. It no longer holds the same influence because the focus has shifted to what can be built moving forward, to the relationships that can be strengthened, to the experiences that can be shared in a way that is healthy and fulfilling. And that shift is what defines the true outcome of everything that has happened, because it demonstrates that change is possible, that growth is achievable, and that even in situations where dynamics have been deeply ingrained, there is always the potential for something better, something more balanced, something more aligned with what truly matters. And as the story continues to unfold, that potential remains at the forefront, shaping the next chapter in a way that reflects the lessons learned, the boundaries set, and the commitment to moving forward with intention and purpose. And that is what ultimately leaves a lasting impact. Not the conflict, not the tension, but the resolution, the understanding, the willingness to evolve, and the recognition that true strength lies not in control, but in the ability to adapt, to grow, and to show up in a way that fosters connection rather than division. And that is the legacy that will carry forward, not one defined by authority or expectation, but one built on respect, presence, and the courage to choose a different path when it matters most. And just like that, the man who demanded control is left watching from the outside while everyone else moves on without him. And trust me, this story is far from over. If you want more shocking breakdowns like this, hit subscribe right now because the next twist might be even